The Northumberland Fusiliers were formed in 1674 by William of Orange from Holland, who wanted to raise a brigade of troops to help in his fight against the French. So he recruited enough men to form 4 regiments, 2 English, 1 Scots and 1 Irish. The Irish regiment was commanded by a man called Viscount Clare, but he was soon replaced by a Northumbrian, Sir John Fenwick. Sir John Fenwick changed the Irish flavour to English by recruiting a lot of officers and men from Northumberland to join the regiment. The regimental emblem was taken as St. George and the Dragon, and we'll see an example here, and that formed the cap badge of the regiment and still does today. The regimental motto was Quo Fata Vo Cant, which literally translates as "Whither the Fates Call." The regiment also adopted gosling green, a particular shade of green, for its regimental facings. And we'll see an example of a soldier here with his red coat jacket, but with the green facings on his collars and cuffs and the bottom of his jacket. So this is how the regiment was formed. Now in 1685, the Monmouth Rebellion broke out in England, and the 4 regiments were recalled by James II to fight and defeat the Monmouth Rebellion. After that, the regiment was then taken into the English establishment and became the 5th Regiment of Foot. They returned to Holland to fight again with William of Orange, but returned in 1688 when William of Orange took the throne from James II. James II was a Catholic monarch, and the people the barons, the hierarchy in this country didn't want a Catholic monarchy. So they asked William of Orange to come and be a Protestant king. So he came across in 1688, brought the 4 regiments back with him, and forced James II from the throne. The regiment fought in Ireland. If you look at this, the dates there, 1690 to 91, at the Battle of the Boyne, when William defeated James II. James II went into exile in France, and William became William III of England. And he married he was already married to Queen Mary, so they became William and Mary. The regiment obviously was based in various places over this period: Flanders, Martinique, Ireland, Portugal, and in 1713 they went to Gibraltar, and in 1727 the Great Siege of Gibraltar took place, where the Spanish army tried to retake the island, the rock. During the 4-month siege, 700 artillery and mortar shells landed on the rock in an hour, and the Spanish army kept this up for 4 months until they decided that the fortress was impregnable and they gave up the siege. Phoebe Hessel. Phoebe Hessel is one of the famous people of the 5th of Foot. She was born in 1713 as Phoebe Smith, and it's reputed that she joined the 5th Regiment of Foot, the Northumberland Fusiliers, as a soldier, private soldier, because her boyfriend, Samuel Golding, was in the 2nd Foot, and they were going to the West Indies. So the story is that she joined the 5th of Foot to go out to the West Indies, where she could join Samuel Golding. She eventually married Samuel Golding, and when he died, she married a fisherman in Brighton called William Hessel, hence the name Phoebe Hessel. She died in 1821, aged 108 years. There are a lot of holes in this story. The fact that she joined the 5th to go to the West Indies. When she joined in 1728, if we go back to the previous slide, you'll see that the 5th were actually in Gibraltar, and then they went from there to Ireland. So that part of the story remains a mystery. It also says on a headstone here on the photograph on the right that she fought under the Duke of Cumberland at the Battle of Fontenoy and received a bayonet wound in her arm. Well, the 5th of Foot never fought under the Duke of Cumberland, and they didn't fight at the Battle of Fontenoy either. So it's one of those stories that the 5th like to keep, but there are many holes in it. In the 7 Years' War in 1756 to 63, the 5th fought at the Battle of Willemstad in 1762. They charged 3,000 French troops, the Grenadiers of France and the Royal Grenadiers of France, and put them to flight. When the battle was over, they took the French caps, and this is a particular thing with the Fusiliers. They took the French Grenadier caps and wore them themselves instead of their tricorn hats. They also captured a colour from one of the Grenadier regiments, and this became known as the Willemstad colour. And it's a third colour that's carried by the Fusiliers, and the Fusiliers are the only regiment in the British Army who are allowed to carry a third colour. This is the colour in the front there on the left-hand side, photograph right on the left-hand side. It's normally carried by the most junior drummer in the band. And this is the colour being carried in 1920, and again on the right-hand side in 1949. The King tried to stop this, but because it was a particular battle honour, the 5th, the Northumberland Fusiliers, were allowed to carry this third colour, but only on St George's Day. That's the regimental day. And if you notice on both the colours, they are garlanded at the top with red and white roses, which is the regimental colours of the Northumberland Fusiliers, red and white. And the soldiers, if you look on the left-hand photograph, are wearing red and white rosettes in their hats. And the Fusilier on the right-hand side is wearing a red and white rosette in his beret. In 1768, Hugh, Lord Percy, the second Duke of Northumberland, became Colonel of the 5th of Foot. He'd served in the 5th of Foot as an officer for a number of years, and in 1768 he became Colonel. And this reinforced the link with Northumberland. We'll come back to that one in a second. In 1767, the 5th of Foot inaugurated a Medal of Merit. During these periods, the British soldier had a very poor reputation in the country. They were seen as drunks, bad people. The only people who joined the army were people who couldn't do anything else. They were classed as criminals and all this sort of thing. So to encourage good behaviour, the 5th of Foot instituted this Medal of Merit, and a soldier was awarded a Medal of Merit, a gilt Medal of Merit for 7 years good service. This was where if the soldier kept out of trouble, didn't get into mischief, or didn't appear in front of the commanding officer for any reason, he would get a Medal of Merit. They also got a small increase in pay, good conduct pay it was called. They got a silver medal after 14 years, and another silver medal after 21 years. Now, this medal is unique to the Northumberland Fusiliers. It was never introduced in any other regiment in the British Army, and it stayed in use until 1856, just over 100 years, when the Army introduced the Army Good Conduct Medal, and the Fusiliers were told that they had to discontinue using their own Medal of Merit. So for over 100 years, this medal was used to try and inculcate good behaviour into soldiers. 1774 to 1778, the colonials in the US were rebelling. And in 1775, the 5th of Foot were there. They took part in the Battle of Bunker Hill. The Americans call it Breed's Hill. If you look in the photograph there, you can see the gosling green facings on the back of their hats and on the collars and cuffs of their jackets, and the letter V for the 5th on the back of the caps as well. Breed's Hill was a very strongly fortified position outside Boston. The Fusiliers attacked it twice and were repulsed, but the third charge, the Americans were running low on ammunition and decided they'd had enough, so they retreated in disorder, and the 5th, along with other regiments, the 5th led the charge. They took the hill. It's one of the famous battles of the American War of Independence, and the 5th were there, putting the colonials to flight. In 1778, the regiment was sent to the island of St. Lucia. The island was held by the French at the time, and the British, the Fusiliers in particular, along with other troops, were on a position called the Viggy. You can see that on the map there circled in red. There was 1,400 English troops and 12,000 French. And they put the French to flight. At the end of the battle, the British troops, the Fusiliers in particular, took the white plumes from the caps of the French soldiers and put them in their own caps. And that was retained as a battle honour, the white plume in the cap. And that led to what we call now the hackle. So the hackle is the red and white plume, which is currently worn by the regiment, Royal Regiment, the Fusiliers. We see here the hackle and the badge on the left-hand side. And on the right-hand side is a very smart colour party with the men wearing their hackles in their caps. The regimental story is that the men took the plumes from the French and dipped them in the blood of the French soldiers, hence the red and white hackle. It's a good story, and a lot of people believe it, but it's actually not true. In 1829, King George IV ordered white plumes to be worn by all infantry regiments of the British Army. At that time, only the Fusiliers, the 5th of Foot, wore a white plume. So the Fusiliers petitioned the king to allow them to wear a white plume with the red top as a mark of distinction for this particular battle honour. And that was allowed. And this is how we now have the red and white hackle, which is worn by the current regiment and was worn by the Fusiliers since then. In 1784, Hugh Lord Percy, who we saw earlier, transferred to the Horse Guards, and the regiment petitioned the king to allow the regiment to be renamed the Northumberland Regiment in recognition of his 16 years of valuable service. And this again reinforced the link with Northumberland. In 1793, Napoleon was doing his thing in France, and the British Army was sent to Spain and Portugal, what was called the Peninsular War. The Fusiliers in 1799 formed a second battalion, so they became the 2nd Fifth. The 1st Battalion became the 1st Fifth. This was the usual army thing of increasing the numbers when war breaks out, then we decrease the numbers again when the war is over. We'll talk more about that as the talk goes on. But in 1799, the 2nd Battalion was formed. Both battalions were in France in Portugal and Spain in 1808. This scene is one of the major battles which was fought by the Fusiliers at Badajoz in 1812. Badajoz was a fortified town, and the army was tasked to take the town, which is what they did in those days. The Fusiliers led the charge at this particular point. They were repulsed once, but on the second charge, the commanding officer, Lieutenant Colonel Ridge, who we see on the left here, was the first man up the ladder, and he cleared the way for the men following behind to get to the top of the ladder and start taking the ramparts. In the process, he was killed. He's one of the most famous men of the 5th Foot for having charged up the ladder, up the siege at Badajoz. It was very fierce fighting in those days. This is on the left, Private Peter Newnham, who fought in the Peninsular War. He ran away from home to enlist at the age of 13 in 1806, and he was wounded in one of the Peninsular battles. We don't know which one. The musket ball entered his cheek, but was extracted from his neck, and he survived. He was discharged in Ireland in 1835 after 29 years service. So he didn't do too badly out of being in the Peninsular War all those years. In the centre there is his medal, which is held by the museum. It's called the Military General Service Medal, but it's generally known as the Peninsular War Medal. And you can see he has 7 clasps for the actions in which he fought. If we just go down the list, Toulouse, Orthez, Nivelle, Salamanca, Badajoz, he was at the siege at Badajoz, Ciudad Rodrigo, and Busaco. So a brave man who served a long time and survived. He died in Sussex at the age of 84. During the Peninsular War, the Duke of Wellington, who commanded the troops in Portugal and Spain, after the siege of Badajoz in 1812, he said of the 5th Foot, the ever fighting, often tried, but never failing 5th. And from that, the nickname, the Fighting 5th, was derived. And the 5th Foot were known as the Fighting 5th for a long time. They were also known as Wellington's bodyguard because they protected his headquarters at one point during the Peninsular War. So they were known as Wellington's bodyguard as well. In 1812, the United States Congress declared war on England. There's a surprise. And American troops invaded Canada. Canada was the only part of North America that was still held by the British following the American War of Independence. The first Fifth was sent as reinforcements in 1814 to Canada to help the army. The 2nd Battalion was disbanded at this time because Napoleon had been defeated. He was in exile on the island of Elba. and it wasn't expected that there would be another war with France. So the 2nd Battalion had been disbanded. The war in Canada was ended in 1815 by the Treaty of Ghent. And by this time, Napoleon had escaped from Elba and reformed his army in France and was heading towards Waterloo. The 5th were sent back from America, from Canada, but they were at sea when the Battle of Waterloo was fought. So the 5th didn't fight in the Battle of Waterloo. They did, however, become part of the Army of Occupation of France after the Battle of Waterloo, and they remained there for a couple of years till 1818 as part of that Army of Occupation. We see here on the left a private of the Light Company, and on the right a corporal of the Grenadier Company. This was the fashion of the day, to form elite companies, either of light infantry or elite companies of grenadiers. They tended to be the best men in the regiment. A lot of commanding officers didn't agree with this because it meant that the best men were taken away sometimes and weren't part of the regiment when they had to fight particularly difficult battles. But that was the way things were done in those days. And there we have it. In 1836, the 5th of Foot became a Fusilier regiment. The Fusilier is derived from the French fusil. A fusil was a particular type of musket. If we look at the picture here, the top one is the standard British Army Enfield musket that was in use in 1836. And the bottom picture is a fusil musket, which was shorter and lighter. And regiments who carried this shorter and lighter musket were called Fusilier regiments. I think because it was shorter, I don't think it was as accurate. But then if you think that battles were fought at very close range in those days, I don't think it really mattered. But that's how the Fusiliers became known as Fusiliers. The regiment was then named the 5th of Foot Northumberland Fusiliers. In 1881, the old regimental numbering system, the 5th of Foot, was discontinued, and the regiment was simply known as the Northumberland Fusiliers. 1857, the Indian Mutiny. Don't want to go too much into the background of that, but the 1st Battalion, the Northumberland Fusiliers, fought in the siege and relief of Lucknow in 1857. We see here on the left the regiment still retained their red jackets, but later on the regiments were issued with white jackets, which were more appropriate to the Indian climate and the Indian fighting in the Indian Mutiny. During the siege and relief of Lucknow, the regiment won 3 Victoria Crosses. We've got the 3 here. If you look, Sergeant Grant on the left-hand side, he went out under fire and rescued a soldier who had been shot in the leg. And with the help of another man, he carried the wounded man to safety. So he won the Victoria Cross for that. He later, when he left the army, went on to join the Metropolitan Police, and he died of consumption in London in 1874, and he's buried in Highgate Cemetery. And there was a couple of years ago, the Metropolitan Police and the Fusiliers got together to replace the headstone on his grave because it had fallen into disrepair. So that just happened recently. In the centre, Private Peter McManus, a fighting Irishman. He was trapped in a house with 9 other men during the relief of Lucknow. And they again rushed out into the street. A man called John Ryan from the Madras Fusiliers, the two of them, to rescue a Captain Arnold from the Madras Fusiliers. Private Ryan, also who wasn't a Northumberland Fusilier, also won the VC for that particular action. McManus died from smallpox in India in 1859, so he only had his VC for a couple of years. Patrick McHale, he was another Irishman in the Fusiliers. During an attack on a village, mutineer's gun was causing the Fusiliers a lot of casualties. So McHale charged the gun on his own, killed the gun crew, and with the help of some of his colleagues, his comrades, turned the gun round and used it against the mutineers. He died in 1866 and he's buried in Shorncliffe Military Cemetery in Kent. Following the defeat of Napoleon, the main duties of the regiments at that time were to police the empire, imperial duty as it was called. And you can see from these two charts the different locations that the two battalions, the 2nd Battalion had been reformed in 1857 when the mutiny broke out. And you can see the different locations where the battalion served right across the world, right across the empire in that 80-year period. In 1872, the government organised a system, or the War Office organised a system where most infantry regiments had 2 battalions, and the 2-battalion system was used where 1 battalion would serve in the UK or Ireland and the other battalion would serve abroad. The home battalion would provide replacements and recruits for the battalion abroad. The battalion abroad was always kept up to full strength, whereas the home battalion was always under strength. And if you look at the chart there, you'll see, say, for example, in the 2nd Battalion in 1880 were in India and the 1st Battalion were in England. And then in 1898, the 1st Battalion were in Egypt, and in 1897, the 2nd Battalion were in Portland and Devon, in Dorset. So that's how the system worked. The could spend long periods overseas. The 2nd Battalion were 17 years in India and Singapore. The 1st Battalion was 17 years in England, and that's how the system worked. Barrack life in the 19th century was very tough, particularly for married men. This is a scene in a barrack block, the soldier with his wife and young child. They didn't get married quarters or separate accommodation as they do now. The men had to sleep in one end of the barrack room with a curtain across the end for privacy, and that's all they got. In 1899, the South African War, the Boer War, broke out. Both regular battalions of the Northumberland Fusiliers took part in the war, and in addition, 3 other battalions were formed, the 3rd, 4th and 5th battalions. The 3rd and 4th served in South Africa. The 5th battalion went to Malta as a garrison battalion to release regular troops to go and fight in South Africa. The South African War highlighted a number of flaws in tactics and training of the British infantry, particularly in marksmanship skills. I think that by the end of the South African War, there was something like 300,000 British troops in South Africa. They didn't rate the Boers very highly at the start, but the Boers were expert horsemen an expert marksman, and caused the British Army lots of problems during the South African War. As a result of that, the marksmanship skills and training of British soldiers was put on a more regulated footing after the war, and this stood them in good stead at the outbreak of the First World War, which we'll come on to in a minute. Regimental life in 1900 to 1914, from the Boer War to the First World War. The regiment still wore red coats, black trousers. You can see there the red and white hackles in their bearskins. As we get to the mid part of that period, in about 1908, khaki uniforms and better equipment was introduced, which would be the start of their First World War experience. But that process took from 1900 to 1914. As I said before, training was more formalized. Marksmanship was one of the key elements. They were trained to fire 15 rounds a minute from their bolt action rifles, and most of them could do that. They also introduced service pay, so the better shot you were, the more pay you got. If you were a marksman, you got an increase in your pay, and they had various different levels of shot so that you could get an increase in pay if you did well at marksmanship. In addition, during this period in 1908, the Territorial Army, the Territorial Forces it was called, was introduced, and they formed the backbone of parts of the Fusiliers in the First World War. Start of the First World War, 1914. We'll see on the left photograph here, this is a territorial. He wears leather equipment. The man next to him with the steel helmet wears web equipment, which was better. By the end of the war, everybody had the web equipment. In the centre, we'll see a recruiting poster for the Tyneside Scottish, who were one of the battalions formed. And on the right-hand side was a couple of views of the men in the trenches. Now, these two views, in some parts of Flanders, they couldn't dig the trenches because the water table was so high that as soon as they'd gone down a couple of feet, it filled up with water. So the trenches were built up by sandbags, like you see in these photographs. So they weren't actually dug down, they were built up so that they didn't get waterlogged in the trenches. In the First World War, the battalions won a further 5 VCs. 2 were won in Italy, Private Wood for the 10th Battalion and Second Lieutenant Ewell in Italy, and the other 3 were won on the Western Front. The top left photograph we see Ernest Sykes from the 27th Battalion receiving his Victoria Cross from the King. Apart from the Victoria Cross winners, I just wanted to highlight 3 ordinary men from the Fusiliers who fought who took part in the First World War. On the left, Sergeant Alf Wilson, he'd joined the army in, just check my notes, in 1889, and he was discharged in 1910 after 21 years service. When the war broke out in 1914, he rejoined immediately, and he was discharged in 1920 after another 5.5 years service. He didn't serve abroad. He stayed at the depot in Newcastle at Fenham Barracks and trained soldiers to go and fight because he was a marksman instructor, a musketry instructor, but he was too old to go and fight, but he utilised his skills to train men to go and fight in France. Corporal John Crisp in the middle, he was a Amble man. He joined in Amble, and he was killed in the Battle of the Somme, 1st of July 1916. He's got no known grave, and he's commemorated on the Thiepval Memorial in France. And then on the right, we'll have Private Tommy Reed. He was a territorial, served in the 4th Battalion. He was killed at the Battle of Passchendaele in 1917, and he's got no known grave either. His name is commemorated on the Tyne Memorial in Belgium. We'll see there at the bottom, the Commonwealth War Graves Commission record 17,755 Fusiliers died in the war. This does not include men who joined the Fusiliers but were transferred to other regiments. So that number is more than is stated there. In the interwar years, in 1935, as part of King George's Silver Jubilee celebrations, the regiment was granted the title Royal. So they became the Royal Northumberland Fusiliers from that date onwards. Infantry regiments were reorganized. They introduced something called a machine gun battalion to reintroduce machine guns into the infantry. And the 1st and 2nd battalions were reorganized as machine gun battalions. The 4th battalion became a motorcycle reconnaissance battalion. The 5th battalion became a searchlight regiment of the Royal Artillery. 6th battalion became a tank regiment, and the 7th battalion became a machine gun battalion. And this is how the Fusiliers were structured at the start of the Second World War. We see here that in the pictures, the machine gunners at the bottom left and in the centre, training on the machine guns, the 4th battalion on their motorcycle combinations, and the tracked carriers of the machine gun battalions. These are the carriers that they use to carry their machine guns and ammunition. At the outbreak of the war, Second World War, the 2nd Battalion were part of the 4th Division in France. The 4th Battalion were part of the 50th. The 7th Battalion were part of the 51st. And the 8th and 9th were part of the 23rd Division in France. They were all evacuated from Dunkirk in 1940 and reformed in this country following that evacuation. Again, the two photographs we see the units. These are both of the 4th Battalion in France in 1940. And on the right-hand side, a machine gunner carrying his machine gun. That picture is little bit incorrect, because that machine gun is quite heavy, and I don't think you'd be striking such a good pose with that on his shoulder. In the Middle East, the regiment won another VC, Captain Jackman, who was in charge of a machine gun unit in the Western Desert. He was unfortunately killed in the battle at a place called Ed Dudda in the Western Desert. The 1st Battalion and the 4th Battalion were both involved in that battle. From the Western Desert, the 1st and 2nd Battalions went to Italy in 1943. They became support battalions. In addition to the machine guns, they received mortars, which we see in the centre here, heavy mortars, and anti-aircraft guns. So they became support battalions instead of just machine gun battalions. This is one of the saddest stories of the Fusiliers in the Second World War. The 9th Battalion went to Singapore. They were earmarked to go to the Far East, but they were diverted to Singapore. They arrived on the 5th of February 1942, and the island was surrendered on the 15th. So they were only actually in action for 10 days before they surrendered. We see in the picture here Major Flower, who was the commanding officer, parleying with the Japanese troops at the point of surrender. The battalion went into captivity, and the majority of them served on the Burma-Siam Railway, the infamous Burma-Siam Railway. 151 Fusiliers died in captivity. A lot of the remainder came back with various diseases and malnutrition and suffering from the ill effects of ill treatment by the Japanese. This battalion had the highest casualty rate of all the battalions in the Second World War, and it's a very sad story. 1944-45, invasion of Europe. We'll see there the troops coming ashore on D-Day. The 4th Battalion were split into independent machine gun companies. The 7th Battalion became a support battalion, and the 8th Battalion became the 3rd Reconnaissance Regiment. Each of those battalions supported a different division in the invasion of Europe, and subsequently right up to the surrender of Germany in 1945. One additional VC was won. Major Robert Kane, he was attached to the South Staffordshire Regiment, who went to Arnhem in 1944, and he won his VC at Arnhem in 1944. In total, the Commonwealth War Grave Commission records 895 Fusiliers killed in the Second World War, a vastly less number than were killed in the First World War. This is because a lot of the warfare was mechanized and long range, and a completely different method of fighting from the First World War. The regiment was reduced to 1 battalion after the First World War, 1 regular battalion, and they went to Korea in 1950. They fought at the Battle of Injun River on St. George's Day and subsequent days in April 1950. The battalion lost 13 men killed, 83 wounded and 46 missing. Their commanding officer was also killed, Colonel Foster, in the battle. If we look on the left-hand side here, the Fusiliers were part of the 29th Independent Infantry Brigade with the Gloucesters and the Royal Irish Fusiliers, Royal Irish Regiment, and they were attacked by 3 Chinese divisions and pushed back off their positions. We see there the Fusiliers' line of retreat. The battle went on for 2 days before the Fusiliers were withdrawn. If you look at the photograph on the right-hand side, the Fusilier on the right with a berry, he's still got his rosette, his St. George's rosette in his cap, because obviously 23rd of April is St. George's Day, the regimental day, and he's still wearing his rosette. End of empire. The regiment served in Kenya against Mau Mau, Suez, Egypt, all over. This is one of the last actions as part of the end of empire. In 1966, the battalion were in Aden as part of the British garrison. On the 20th of June 1967, 2 Land Rovers of the battalion were ambushed, and 9 Fusiliers were killed. The picture on the left-hand side shows Sergeant Major Pringle of the 1st Battalion. On the left-hand side is Fusilier Hume and Fusilier Davidge, who was wounded by a grenade fragment, and Fusilier Anderson on the right-hand side. The guy lying on the ground is the man who threw the grenade. He was shot dead in the process. On the right-hand side is a helicopter crash. The helicopter was fired on from the police barracks in Aden town and crashed at Temple Cliffs. And we see here Fusilier Duffy, who won the Distinguished Conduct Medal, pulling Sergeant Ford, the pilot, out of the plane. And lying beside it is Lance Corporal Keithley, who lost his leg. Lance Corporal Keithley's granddaughter was in the museum just a few weeks ago, just before Christmas. 23rd of April 1968, the regiment was amalgamated. The Northumberland Fusiliers, the Warwickshires, the Royal Fusiliers and the Lancashire Fusiliers to become the Royal Regiment of Fusiliers, and that's the regiment which exists today. And that regiment continues to uphold all the traditions of all its former regiments, and they've served in campaigns across the world: Bosnia, Cyprus, Hong Kong, Northern Ireland, the Gulf Wars, both Gulf Wars, and Afghanistan. And I'd just like to end with the Hackle cocktail. Fusilier officers on a tour of Northern Ireland during the Troubles came up with this particular concoction. I've never tried it, but I'll leave that up if anyone wants to copy that down and give it a try. Last but not least, the Fusiliers Museum were open from 11 till 5 during the open season. Alnwick Castle is closed over the winter months, reopens at Easter, and is open till usually about the end of October. The museum has free entry, but if you want to go in just to visit the museum and get free entry, you need to ring the museum before you come to arrange the visit. Otherwise, you have to pay castle admission fees. And last but not least, we're always looking for volunteers. If anyone has some spare time, wants to come up, we usually meet once a week on a Thursday and do lots of interesting military stuff if anybody's interested. I'm going to put the Hackle cocktail back up. And that's me. Any questions?